Good afternoon. I'm Brad Jensen. I'm a professor at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business. And on behalf of Georgetown University and the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, I'd like to say welcome to this Georgetown on the Hill event on trade adjustment. It is a fantastic panel that my colleague Bob Vastine has organized. I'm very much looking forward to the comments, but before we turn to the substance, I just wanted to give a word about the Georgetown Center. We run an active program on trade policy. We meet here up on the Hill about every month, but the Georgetown Center also has an active program in other substantive domains. We have an active program in regulation, transportation, the environment, and innovation. So I would strongly encourage you to check out the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy's website. Without further ado, let me turn it over to my colleague, Bob Vastine, who will introduce the panel and run the program.
Thank you, Brad. Thanks very much, and thanks everyone for being here. Because we have a full panel and starting a little bit late, I'm going to ask you all to take a look at your handouts, which describe in some exquisite detail the really impressive backgrounds of our 5 speakers. So, I mean, the bottom line here is that we're here to discuss trade and its effect on employment in this country and what is being done about that, what can be done, what might be done. And so we've called upon Jerry Fiala, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Employment and Training at the U.S. Department of Labor, and has an extensive Hill background, I'm pleased to say. So, Jerry, welcome. I have to say in advance, however, that Jerry has explained that the Deputy Secretary commands her presence at 1 o'clock, and her place will be taken at the table by Julie Baker. So, Jerry, welcome.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Bob. I have the, oh.
You got it.
Is it there?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to just talk to you a little bit about trade and the place it plays in a toolbox for workforce development for workers in this country and employers. As you all know, we live in a world that's been changing for decades with sort of the inexorable forces of globalization and technology. And while there are tremendous benefits for this, there can be costs to this as well, particularly for workers and particularly in some industries and towns that can be hit very hard. And what we have done is we have focused on investing in these workers, in these communities, in these industries, to prepare workers who have been affected by these trends for reemployment. And they are workers who clearly have, through no fault of their own, become unemployed due to trade agreements. TAA has been around for 40 years. And it has supported the workforce and communities adversely affected by globalization. For the past 5 years, 240,000 trade-affected workers participated in the TAA program, and it helped 227,000 workers get back to work in good jobs. These workers are also retaining their employment longer. We have several measures that we use for performance to gauge the success of these programs. The entered employment rate for TAA participants has risen significantly from 65% in 2009, which, if you'll recall, we were in a time of great economic stress, to 74% for fiscal year 2015. The employment retention rate, in essence, of those who got jobs, do they keep them? The employment retention rate for TAA participants increased from 89.5% in 2011 to 92.3% in 2015, and their 6-month average earnings was $17,911. And more importantly, nearly 90% of them who went through training got an industry-recognized credential, which is important for their reemployment. And this could have been a skills credential. For many of them, it started with a high school credential because the average TAA worker is older, is 48, is male. Over half of them have a high school degree at best. So it is important to make sure that they have the credentials to take advantage of technical skill programs and then to move into new careers. The TAA program, I have to say thank you. We had experienced a 6-year reauthorization and extension of TAA in June of 2015. And it provides now the valuable job training, case management, reemployment services to more American workers that are displaced by the forces of globalization. And among other things, this reauthorization expanded TAA eligibility. It now supports workers in the service sector and those that are affected by trade with countries with whom we do not have free trade agreements, so that it includes China and India. And a year after reauthorization, there have been dramatic improvements resulting from it. The number of estimated workers currently eligible for benefits and services is over 100,000, which is almost double the number of workers that were eligible for TAA benefits and services in fiscal year 2015. So that's terribly important. And this includes 18,000 workers that are now covered from their previously denied petitions, because we had to, by law, go back and look at the petitions that had been denied to find out whether or not they became eligible under the new law. So that is important to know. So again, we say thank you to that. The other important thing about TAA is it is a mandatory partner in the public workforce system. There was a law that was enacted a couple of years ago, bipartisan law, called the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, for those of you who may not be familiar with that. And in that law, it makes trade adjustment assistance a mandatory partner in the one-stop delivery system. And the reason why that's important is there may be TAA workers who require other kinds of services in addition to those authorized under TAA. And if they do, they can be co-enrolled to make sure that they get the package of services they need to successfully complete their training and find that new good job. So in addition to that, I wanted to mention the fact that TAA is kind of complicated to understand if you're a worker, and it's kind of complicated to understand, frankly, if you're an employer or you're helping people through a one-stop center. And one of the services under WIOA that benefits potentially eligible workers, I'm sorry, the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, I can't say that long name more than twice, so it's going to be WIOA, is rapid response. Rapid response is authorized under WIOA. It is a state-level service. Funds are set aside for governors to use in concert with local areas. And what it does is it helps address economic transitions for both businesses and for workers. It allows states and local areas to play an active role in kind of shaping and maintaining the services in communities and with the workforce. It includes layoff aversion, working with employers if that is a possible approach. It also includes the information and dissemination to workers prior to being laid off about all of the information and services that they may be available for. So in essence, they can start the process of knowing what might be available to them early on.
You said worker aversion?
I said layoff aversion. So layoff aversion services, working with companies, and also many services and information types of information to workers about what they may be available for. And that can certainly include, the fact that you may be eligible to you may petition for eligibility for TAA. Here's how you file it. Here are the benefits for it. There are other services that are available to you. So the idea is an individual needs to know the complexity, be able to, find a pathway, if you will, through the complexity of different programs to figure out what it is that they need and how best they can access those services. So rapid response is the first step for both employers and for workers in this process. Then petitions can be filed. They are investigated by the Department of Labor, by Julie Baker's office, and those petitions are determined to be eligible or not. And once they're eligible, individual workers can apply in their own states for benefits and services. I just wanted to say, TAA is complicated because it's operating right now in states 4 different programs. It operates a 2002 program, it operates a 2009 program, a 2011 program, and the new 2015 program. So you do need some help to sort through all of this. And these programs will end over time, and the 2015 program will stay. But workers are getting services under all of those programs right now. Now, the training, there was an evaluation done. We have a synthesis of findings that was prepared in 2012. That evaluation was based primarily on the 2002 program, which was not nearly as robust as the current program. It did not have case management. It did not have fulsome training. There was not coordination between the systems, and all of those things are terribly important. It also didn't make an assumption that workers need to get into training quickly, as opposed to waiting over a period of time, because the longer they separate from a job before they go into training, the more challenging it is to get them to complete that training and move on. So there were promising, clearly TAA, even in that less robust program, was of benefit to TAA participants who were younger when looking at comparison groups. And it was also true that the trainees in TAA, their incomes were lower than the comparison group when they, for the initial study, but it really isn't surprising because they were in training full-time. You have to be in training full-time under that early program, so you're not out there earning a full salary. So over time, we have watched those incomes increase. So I wanted to mention that to you because I know that there are people who talk about the evaluation, but it was on the less robust program. We are in the process of designing a new evaluation of the current program, but in the meantime, we have the performance statistics that show that TAA participation is of benefit in terms of the entered employment rates, the retention rates, and the earning rates.
Because Ms. Fiala has to leave early, I'm going to make an exception and ask if there is a question for her before she leaves.
And if not, you have Julie. She's wonderful.
Okay? All right. Then we'll move on to Jamie White. Jamie is a longtime friend and expert in international trade policy. He's the chief advisor to the leading Democrat, Senator Wyden, in the Senate Finance Committee, and a well-known and well-recognized expert on international trade policy. Jamie.
It's good to be here. I've been asked to talk about TAA in the kind of a broader context of trade policy formulation more generally. I think I kind of want to start with where the U.S. was way back, coming out of the Second World War, As a lot of you know, we started the GATT negotiations actually during the war. But basically, since 1947, the U.S. started leading rounds of GATT negotiations to reduce tariffs in the U.S. and in our trading partner countries, our allies mainly. So the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program was created in 1962 at a very, very different time. It was in the midst of all these GATT negotiations. But just keep in mind, we were only 15 years beyond the Second World War. The Iron Curtain still separated us from Eastern Europe. China was closed. We barely had container ships. And today, the world is much different. We now have one of the most open markets in the world. China is open. The Berlin Wall, the Iron Curtain fell. So it's a very different environment, which to me makes a case for why TAA is more important than ever before. So what's the background on TAA? The benefits of TAA the TAA program has never been made permanent. Typically what's happened is Congress has renewed TAA or expanded TAA in conjunction with consideration of a new trade agreement or in conjunction with consideration of legislation to provide the president with fast-track authority or trade promotion authority, which by many is viewed as a necessary authority for a president to conclude a big trade negotiation and get a trade agreement through the Congress. And over the past 60 years, American presidents have used this authority and negotiated trade agreements, and Congress has always passed those trade agreements. But when Congress has passed those trade agreements, while it's pretty clear that it recognized those trade agreements were in the national interest of the country for economic and other reasons, the sentiment was that Congress recognized that more global competition that results from those trade agreements can negatively impact American companies and the workers upon which they rely. So that direct choice resulted in a direct responsibility from the Congress to expand or renew TAA. And in fact, you saw this last year where in conjunction with considering trade promotion authority, Congress not only renewed TAA, but thanks in part to Senator Wyden's leadership, we doubled the amount of training money that's available for TAA, and we also expanded TAA to include service sector workers, which is the largest segment of our economy. But one question I think some of us need to continue to ask is, we have a very different kind of global environment. We have a more global economy than when we first established TAA, and beyond TAA, does our sort of economic safety net provide the security that workers need in a more challenging environment? So, for instance, if you lose your job in the United States because of foreign trade, you can qualify for TAA. But to the worker who lost his or her job because of technological change, are they less deserving than the worker that lost their job to foreign trade? Because that worker that just lost their job to technological change, they are left with the unemployment insurance system, which at this point, there's so much flexibility given to states on how they run their unemployment insurance systems that it's a federal insurance program in name only. So the safety net for those types of workers is significantly less than those that lose their job to unfair trade. And I highlight that because, I think that especially in this political environment where there is evidently a lot of anxiety about trade and about foreign competition, I think we have to bear in mind that in the U.S., so much is attached to a job, right? Our healthcare is attached to a job, our pensions attached to a job, our Social Security is attached to our job. And so it makes sense that when we consider these economic issues that could impact employment, why there is so much anxiety. And so my hope is that as we continue this discussion around trade liberalization, we think about what we did on TAA last year, the important role of TAA, but also look to that as a beginning, not an end, to address the economic anxiety that workers have as the United States continues to liberalize trade and promote globalization.
Good job. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, it's hard to see. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'll pick up, I think, where Jamie left off.
Sorry.
That's all right. I'll play with yours in a few minutes.
Interesting.
Bob wanted me to reprise a column I wrote for the Stimson Center Trade 21 project, of which I'm a part, which addressed in general terms, because it was this long and not a book, does trade really kill jobs? And so let me do that in a couple points, and then make a couple comments that reflect on what Jamie said as well. The essence of the point I tried to make there is that there's a lot of data, 35 years, that shows that if you look at it statistically, unemployment has generally declined at the same time that imports as a proportion of GDP have risen. And that if you look at the most significant case of the reverse, which was the recession in 2008, 9, and so on, there was a spike in unemployment. Unemployment went way up at the very moment that imports went way down. Now, which is the opposite of what some people would have us believe. Now, does that mean there's the relationship between trade and unemployment is a positive one, more trade, more jobs? It doesn't mean that at all. But what it does mean is that the relationship is unclear, and it clearly means there's an awful lot more going on in our economy than simply trade. Technological improvement, which is Jamie alluded to, other kinds of productivity improvement, changes in consumer taste have a lot to do with this, more than anything else. We have an economy that has, one of its great virtues is it has a lot of churn. It's a dynamic economy. In 2014, we created, well, let me go back, do it in reverse. In 2014, there were 55.1 million job separations, and there were 57.9 million hires. So the net gain of 2.8 million. Of course, if you were Donald Trump, you would say we lost 55 million jobs that year, and it's all Obama's fault. That's only part of the story. You know, we gained more. So the question is, what was the role of trade in all that? Most economists would tell you that kind of churn is the mark of a healthy economy, that you're able to do that. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has spent some time actually during that period and subsequently until they ran out of money and had to stop doing it, trying to figure out the extent to which layoffs were caused by trade as opposed to other things. And what they concluded was that between 1996 and 2006, mass layoffs due to import competition or overseas relocation, in other words, offshoring, amounted to 3.5% or less of the total amount of mass layoffs during that 10-year period. In a slightly later period, 2008 through 2011, they looked specifically at workers laid off due to imports and concluded that it was consistently less than 1% of the total. Clearly, there's a lot of other things happening in our economy besides trade that is the cause of the difficulties we have now. That, of course, is aggregate, and economists like to talk about aggregate. The reality is that people live their lives in the specific, not in the general, and that there are clearly lots of examples of people who lost their jobs because of trade. And that's why we have the program, and that's a question I think that we have to deal with more proactively, because we very clearly have a large number of people out there in our economy who are very unhappy campers because they've lost their jobs or because their children or neighbor or relative has lost his or her job. And they all think it's because of trade. And the standard economist argument, which is you're wrong, isn't really doing the job in terms of persuading them that they're wrong. There's a lot of data that you can demonstrate, again, that it's more complicated. Most of the response from the people that are trade concerned is in this sort of manufacturing versus services area, where there's been a significant loss of manufacturing jobs, which goes back 50 years, not 20 years. We've been losing manufacturing jobs since 1970 fairly consistently. The irony is, which kind of proves one of my points, is that we're making more stuff than we've ever made, but we're just doing it with fewer workers. There's been a lot of productivity improvement, most of it caused by technological change during that period. So the manufacturing output numbers continue to look very strong. Manufacturing employment continues to decline. It was 25% of non-farm jobs in 1970. 2 years ago, it was 9%. So manufacturing is becoming a less important part of our economy. As Jamie said, services are by now far and away the most important part of our economy. But what we hear in the trade debate is all these good manufacturing jobs have been lost to worse, cheap services jobs. And like everything else, this is sometimes true. You know, if the lost manufacturing job was in the steel industry and the newly created services job is behind the counter at KFC, there clearly is an income disparity there. And if the steel worker ended up behind the counter at KFC, he had a significant income loss and a status loss and a whole bunch of things. If the newly created job on the other services job, on the other hand, was anesthesiologist, not quite so clear. And so the reality of what's happening in our economy is a lot more complicated than actually either side in this debate would have you believe. That said, we live in a situation where, as I said, a whole bunch of people believe that trade is the problem, and that the solution, apparently, it's one of the ironies, ask them the solution. The solution seems to be less trade, which is probably not right. The right solution is exactly what we're here to talk about today, which is how do we help the victims of the accelerated change that trade creates cope with that change? How do we create a workforce which is better skilled, better educated, and fundamentally more agile than it used to be? My parents were supposed to have had, on an average, 2 jobs in their career. I'm told that I'm supposed to have 9, which means I've passed my expiration date. My children are supposed to have 17, I think, and the millennials, well, one of mine is a millennial, the next generation will have even more than that. How do you prepare people for a life in which they're going to be fairly frequently moving from job to job and from career to career? Trade adjustment assistance is one way to look at it. That said, and I have to say that I think Jamie makes a very good point on separating TAA from everything else. And I say this with some sadness. Without question, I can tell you I'm the biggest defender of TAA in this room. I fell on my sword many, many times in the 20 years I spent up here on the Hill trying to save this program, successfully, I might add. But the reality is that the implicit bargain that created it with labor in 1962, which was the government would provide a viable program for the victims of trade change, and labor, in turn, would acquiesce in the Kennedy round and the negotiations that ensued, that bargain has essentially been broken by both sides. The government has not delivered on a real, successful, fully funded program, despite Senator Wyden's good works, which really were good works. The program is a pale imitation of what it needs to be to meet the demand that we've got. And the fact is, labor routinely opposes trade agreements anyway. There is no longer a political rationale for having a separate program and for saying we're going to treat this group of unemployed people this way and we're going to treat this other group of unemployed people differently. They all have the same problem. In many cases, their problems were caused by the same thing because it's technological change as much as anything else. And we need to focus on the whole population of unemployed and talk about retraining. We have a program which I think, despite the best efforts of the Labor Department and despite the best efforts of the Congress last year, is still underfunded, has insufficient benefits that don't last long enough. It has training timetables and a training duration that are not always appropriate and does not adequately provide other services. And we have a population, as I said, that is blaming everything on trade. If we're going to transform the trade debate, which is one of the things that I'm interested in, then we have to come up with a viable program to address the actual problems of the people that have lost their jobs and get away from the question of whose fault it is or why it happened and focus on the question of how do we fix it, how do we provide training, how do we provide a greater benefit package? How do we deal with the pension and health care problems that Jamie also talked about, which are absolutely essential if you're a mother or a father of a family of kids and you lose your health insurance because you've lost your job. you've got a whole bunch of problems that transcend simply the salary. There are answers to that, and I'm going to stop and leave it. We can do this in Q&A. I would just say that the place that is most looked to for answers is Denmark, believe it or not, which has spent a lot of time thinking about this and has developed a program which has its own flaws and has had its own difficulties in the wake of the recession and a government recently, a new government that has cut back on some of the benefits. But essentially, they created a concept that is worth looking at here, which is, in a way, it's easier to lose your job. You have less security, but there's a lot more flexibility for the workers, a much higher benefit package, as long as the worker moves into a well-integrated, well-managed, immediate retraining program that deals with a lot of other worker needs as well. And I won't go into that in more detail, although I can later, but it's not like there is no answer. You know, there are answers out there. Every country has this problem. Some deal with it better than others. I think if we spend more time looking at the successes in various other places, we could formulate a better program here if we're willing to spend more money to do it. Thank you.
Okay, Dan.
Thank you, Bob. Bob asked me to speak to give the Cato perspective on these issues, and I can assure you there is no single Cato perspective. We have a wide diversity of opinions within a very, very narrow sliver of the ideological spectrum. So we all speak for ourselves here. You know, Bob and I spoke on the phone shortly after that now famous paper by Otter, Dorn, Hansen, and Chang came out earlier this year called The China Shock, which I think was being held up by certain people as refutation of Adam Smith and comparative advantage of David Ricardo, which I think the authors have distanced themselves from. But it got me thinking in terms of defending trade. Trade has one role. Trade has the single role of growing the pie. Right? And it's been quite successful at that. It is the responsibility of domestic policymakers, to make sure that the benefits, that pie is divided properly, that those who are adversely affected by trade or technology or whatever it is can find new jobs, to remove frictions in the labor market. The way the debate has been framed makes plausible this idea that we should restrict trade to keep people in their jobs and keep the status quo, and that's unacceptable. I think we need to figure out how to help people out who've lost their jobs not only because of trade but because of technology. It's been discussed already. Technological gains on the demand side, changes in consumer tastes. I mean, Americans spend more than twice as much on services than on goods, and that change, that evolution has affected the job mix. So how does trade grow the pie? I mean, think about it. All of us in this room, I assume, are professionals, white-collar professionals, who probably have no idea how to hunt or to make their own clothing or build their own houses. Yet you enjoy food, clothing, and shelter. You enjoy all the basic necessities and luxuries, but you're specializing. You're specializing in what you do. Your output is monetized. You use your salary to purchase the things that other people produce. That's trade. Imagine if you had to do all these other things on a daily basis, provide for your necessities and your luxuries. If you even had time for that, you wouldn't. You would be subsisting. So we trade. It's good within our borders. Expanding it across borders makes a lot of sense, I think. You know, we think in terms of one of the questions of economics is how do we overcome the scarcity question? You know, we want to use resources in a way to address the scarcity problem. So we want to make more with less. And we have a word for that that's called productivity gains. So if we have 10 people on a production line making $1,000 worth of widgets in a day, $100 each of output, $100 each of income, depending on how you want to look at that. And then a machine comes along that can facilitate the process, and you only need 5 people on the line to do that. Well, 5 people have lost their jobs, but output has just doubled per worker. Income has just doubled per worker. Should we celebrate that new machine, that new capital investment? I think we should. And then it's incumbent upon policymakers to create an environment where business can invest, where business can hire these people and redeploy them. That's how we create wealth. That's the key to rising living standards. And I think that's been impeded. So there are all sorts of reasons for job churn. We talked about some. Technological advances, trade, of course, as part of it. We don't saddle technology with the same sorts of burdens that we seem to saddle trade with. You know, if you pick up your iPhone and you look at these apps on your iPhone, you'll say, wow, there used to be somebody who made film and made cameras, somebody who made clocks and maps and telephone operators. You know, this is technology, right? So I keep reiterating this because I don't want a solution to be on the table, a plausible solution where we need to restrict trade to facilitate or slow down the transition. There are too many frictions in the labor market, and one of the things that I've noticed, and one of the metrics is investment, foreign investment. And there's been a lot of foreign investment in the United States. It's the leading destination for foreign direct investment. There's more foreign direct investment in U.S. manufacturing than in any other country's manufacturing sector by far. We have about $1.2 trillion of foreign investment in the United States. But where's it going? Well, it's going, on a per capita basis at least, to states that have certain policies. You see a lot more on a per capita basis going to South Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama than you do to Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio. We have a federalist system. We have 50 states with different policies. Why do we not pay attention to what is working in some states and what is failing? I'm not saying that Wisconsin should emulate South Carolina's policies entirely, but there should be some trial and error. There should be some willingness to part with the policies of the past that I think that have entrenched some of these labor frictions. So abiding federalism is something that I think we need to do. TAA, well, there's one thing that I share, one conclusion that I share with Sherrod Brown, and that is he's called TAA paying for funeral expenses. With all due respect to people who work on these programs, I don't think that they've been particularly successful. I think it's important to possibly consider some sort of apprenticeship program, some sort of tax code incentives for businesses to hire people just to train them, whether they're manufacturing or services. These are the people who know better, I think, that what the jobs of the future are going to be. You pay them, you incent them through the tax system to hire, to train, in exchange for a commitment to work for a year or two or something like that. And this should apply to anybody who loses a job. It shouldn't just be trade-related. So why don't I stop there? I have, before I stop there, I just want to, one of the things that I think has poisoned the well for trade this year, I mean, trade is easily maligned. It's demagogued. Every 4 years, it's especially demagogued. And the themes that we hear, yeah, and every year in between, but these persistent myths that trade is this competition between Team America and Team China or Team Mexico, or that the trade deficit means that we're losing at trade, or that trade killed manufacturing, or that outsourcing is bad for the U.S. economy. That conversation, of course, doesn't even entertain the idea that we have all this foreign direct investment in U.S. manufacturing, that 6.2 million Americans work for foreign headquartered companies. And we hear that trade only benefits rich corporations as opposed to small companies, and rich people as opposed to working people. The common thread through all those myths is this adverse impact that trade supposedly has on jobs. And I think we need to point out that in a competitive, dynamic economy like ours, there is going to be job churn. Thank God. And we've got very innovative sectors. The job churn is a function of progress. And we need not demonize trade and treat it differently than we do other sources of job churn. Thanks.
Very helpful. Thank you very much. Jeff Schott.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. Thanks, Brad, for inviting me to come here. It's always challenging to be up here and try to avoid giving an economics lecture because you don't deal with economics up here. You deal with politics and how to try to get things done. And sometimes you fail. But let me try to weave some of the very important points that have been made in the panel so far into the current challenges facing the current Congress and what happens after November 8th. The first point to make is that trade has become much more important in the U.S. economy since Bill Reinsch was a young Senate staffer. I'm old enough to remember when he was young. And one of the most influential staffers, I might say, in getting positive things done. But if you go back to the 60s, trade accounted for less, exports and imports, goods and services, accounted for less than 10% of GDP. And now that ratio is over 30%. And what that means is that more and more Americans are affected in their work and in their consumption by what happens overseas and the impact that we have in selling and buying from our partners around the world. And that, of course, means that members of Congress are much more concerned about what happens in their districts and how trade affects income and employment and production. When I was negotiating the Tokyo round, there weren't many members of Congress who were concerned about international trade. And when we had to get instructions for the U.S. position in the Tokyo round, I went to the chairman of the Finance Committee and the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and that basically was enough. And we got our marching orders and we went off and negotiated a deal. And we lost, as a result, 11 votes in total when the Tokyo Round Implementation Act was presented to the Congress in 1979. Combined in the House and Senate, 11 votes lost. That world doesn't exist anymore. And there are now hundreds and hundreds of members who have a vital stake in following what happens on trade and its impact on the U.S. economy. So that's the first point. Second point is the discussion on trade in the Congress and in U.S. politics more broadly now revolves or focuses, unfortunately and incorrectly, on U.S. trade agreements, not on U.S. trade. And so that is the platform where we have a trade debate. And it's rather odd, because if you look at recent U.S. trade agreements, and including the TPP, those agreements have had little impact on U.S. job dislocation because they have not required substantial changes in existing U.S. practices and protection. Basically, those agreements have been deals where other countries make concessions to the U.S., to exporters and importers, import some of our rules and regulations, for better or worse. And it's a one-sided deal, and they do it because they want to attract more investment in their own countries, and they want to basically push domestic economic reform in their own countries, and they're using us to pressure them to do the things they want to do and have difficulty doing. Being the big guys, we have a harder time in getting New Zealand or Malaysia or Vietnam to tell us what to do. We're in the business of telling other people what to do. And so we haven't been as successful in pushing the domestic economic reform agenda necessary to push U.S. economic competitiveness. And that has meant not enough investing in U.S. firms and workers. And that is really the challenge that we're facing, and the reason why there's so much dissatisfaction being focused on trade agreements and on the TPP, because essentially you can't say, well, we've let the country down over the past 2 decades by not investing in infrastructure, not investing in the workforce more generally, whether it's TAA or letting a promising program on wage insurance, which would provide incentives for workers who are dislocated to get back into the workforce immediately and get some wage subsidies to soften the income effect of their transition to new employment. But you know, we have to ensure workers have appropriate skills, but we also have to look at firms and make sure that firms aren't so burdened by excessive costs, including logistical costs due to crumbling infrastructure, that they become less competitive and they have to downsize because they can't compete with foreign suppliers who already have good access to the U.S. market. So this is a problem, and it has affected our ability to move forward with a trade policy agenda that promotes U.S. trade competitiveness. TPP does a little. It doesn't change U.S. policies that much. It opens up a lot of great new export opportunities and investment opportunities abroad. It makes big changes in some of the countries like Vietnam in terms of their domestic policies and labor programs. But we're in danger of having a prolonged debate on TPP, just like we had on the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, and suffering the consequences, the same types of consequences that led to a further erosion in U.S. competitiveness in those markets. As other countries continue to push their own domestic reforms, to cut their own deals with their trading partners, which create new discrimination against U.S. exporters, and which improve their competitiveness. This is a problem. We have been penny wise and pound foolish in not promoting what I would call capital investments in the U.S. economy in terms of investing in U.S. facilities and in U.S. workers. And there seems to be a budget ethic here on the Hill that, and in U.S. politics more generally, that argues that these types of programs are current expenditures and not investments in the capital of the U.S. economy, capital base of the U.S. economy. We have to find some way of getting around that. Otherwise, we're going to face continued discrimination. We'll have a hard time in finding new partners to negotiate with us. Investors will sit on the sidelines, not knowing what's going to happen in the U.S. economy because of the unpredictability of policy, similar to what you're seeing now in Britain, where investors have sat on the sideline and are planning their exit because they don't know what the Brits are going to do in terms of leaving the European Union. Well, we're not that bad off. But we are in a situation where there's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines that could be going into productive investments in the U.S. economy, creating more jobs for U.S. workers. That's not happening because they don't know where the demand is, because they don't know what direction U.S. policy is going. That, I think, is a big challenge for the current Congress, which is not going to have time to do it, except if it can focus on a few specific tasks. But it's certainly a big challenge for the next Congress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wow, there's a lot to talk about here. I'm tempted to turn to the panel and ask if one of you has a question of the other, but time is a little bit on the short side, so I think I'll go direct to the audience and ask if there are any questions. Ralph Carter.
Ralph Carter with FedEx. Great panel. Political question. We've heard of a lot of elements that are related to the debate. We've talked about assistance programs. We've talked about investment, infrastructure, and employees. We've talked about, and the candidates the two candidates that we have both come out against DPP. They've cited different things. Trump, I'm not sure what he would do to change the agreement. Clinton has talked about impact on jobs and wages and has talked about things like currency and rules of origin and some kind of discrete issues within the agreement that would need to be fixed, labor enforceability. So my question is, I guess, to Jamie and to Bill and to Jeff, what is the policy mix that you would recommend for the next administration that would help us get back on track in terms of having a trade agenda? Would it have to include elements of increased assistance, increased investment, and some tweaks to TPP? And if so, what would those tweaks be? In other words, what's the package of measures that you think could get the U.S. back on a positive trade agenda, whoever wins next in November? Thank you.
Is that addressed to a particular individual? Do you want to? Go ahead, Bill. Oh, Jamie wins. Good.
He has the answer.
First, it's obvious, should be obvious to everybody that elections matter, and they matter a lot. You know, I think if you look at the debate we had around TPA, that should be informative around future trade debates, where TPA came together. I think I would advocate that it came together as a result of a combination of we improved TAA, but importantly, we improved trade enforcement. So we passed a number of provisions to improve the trade remedy laws, not only in the ability of companies to get relief from unfair trade more quickly, but also that when those anti-dumping or countervailing duties are imposed, they're actually collected. So there was a greater faith by members of Congress that the trade laws and the trade agreements will be enforced and will be able to maximize the benefits of the current deals and future ones. That's how TPA came together, and I think that should inform the next debate. But it was touched on a little bit. I think, you know, perhaps the biggest trade policy that we should consider is an infrastructure policy. You know, if it takes 2 or 3 days longer for a farmer in the U.S. to get their product from the farm to the port, time is money. We held a hearing in the Finance Committee several years ago where we heard from American exporters, whether they were beef exporters or manufacturers like Caterpillar, telling us that they ship through Canadian ports because the infrastructure is better in Canada. The rail infrastructure, the ports, the roads are better in Canada than in the U.S. And when you're talking about perishable goods, that's super important. So I think a conversation around infrastructure is really a conversation around trade, too.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Bill?
Yeah, I'll take a slightly different point of view. Actually, I was at a dinner last night where the same question was asked, and it produced a discussion about there's sort of a distinction between, I think, the right policies to pursue and the right arguments to make to influence the public debate. I agree with Jamie that the policies described, along with the job retraining things that we were talking about earlier, are the right things to do to transform the economy and over the long term transform thinking about it, the way people think about trade. Not unrelated is simply pursuing good economic policy. I mean, if I would say that the news that came out yesterday on the really significant increase in average household income is a hugely important data point, because what that is, it tells people is things are getting better, and they're getting better in a way that matters to, you know, ordinary people. And one job for an administration is to, you know, brag about that every opportunity. But the more important question for the next administration is to continue policies that make sure that continues to happen. In terms of the debate, one of the things, I guess two things I've observed. One is that this is one of these debates that often happens in trade where the left and the right gang up on the center. So some of the things you can do to respond to the criticism of the left and right are sort of the same things because they're coming at it from the same point of view, which is sort of we're marginalized and the you know, the benefits all go to somebody else. I ran into this firsthand last year when I was in a debate about TPA, and I debated, I won't name who it was, but someone who threw me off kilter from the very beginning by saying, this is not about trade, it's about power. And the reality of TPA, and she says the same thing about TPP now, is the reality is that it gives power to the large multinational corporations, and it takes it away from the workers. If you want to transform the debate about trade, you have to address that problem in some meaningful fashion. And one way to do it is, the right way to do it is what we've just been talking about. The other way to do it is by a government administration that actively addresses the inequality question and makes a point that it's the administration policy to deal with income inequality and to reverse the trend of growing income inequality. And I think related to this, and I said this last night at this corporate dinner, which it didn't go over very well, was you also have to get corporations and corporate CEOs in particular to define their tasks in terms of the long-term health of the corporation, the long-term health of the country, and the long-term health of their sector in terms of job creation, and not in terms of shareholder value. And until you can get CEOs to focus that, which is what they used to do 30 years ago, I think the power issue is not going to go away, and it's going to continue to plague the debate.
Interesting. Anybody else? Jeff?
Just very briefly, because I think both those points were very well taken. The first rational thing to do would be to pass TPP, implementing legislation, as quickly as possible. But that requires additional work to make sure there is satisfaction that the problems that have been raised have been adequately addressed.
Jamie's going to take care of it.
And it can be done. It can be done. There's another factor that I'm sure the officials recognize, is that there is a difference between people who say the deal has to be changed and to say that the deal can't be renegotiated. You can add to the deal, and that can be done now and later. So my colleagues Fred Bergston and I have ideas on that.
Oh, do you?
But the more fundamental point is that to adequately address the labor and infrastructure issues, you need revenue. And the budget situation in the Congress is very constrained. And so there has to be some political recognition that you have to commit to some type of tax reform over time while you're proceeding with these investments that we'll be building in. And of course, the recent case against Apple in Ireland has triggered this debate again. And the Treasury has been on the side of Apple because the money will come out of the pockets of the U.S. taxpayer when Apple takes those charges and applies them against their U.S. taxes. So that's something that has to be on the agenda for the next Congress, but it's not something that can suddenly be done and fixed in the first 30 days of the next administration.
Talks about complex issues. Sherry, I think you had your hand up first.
Thank you,
Sherry Stevenson.
Excellent discussion. Thank you, Bob, for organizing. I want to go back to Mr. Reis's very, very interesting statement about Denmark's success in structuring a program of adjustment assistance and retraining at the same time. Maybe ask you to elaborate a little bit on that. And then for anybody in the panel to take it further and say whether or not this is something that could be reproduced in the U.S., and if so, who would champion it?
Well, you have to begin with the fact that it's a different economy. They have a 62% tax rate and a different way of looking at the role of government in the economy, so I'm not sure it's comparable, but they do some interesting things. The one thing they have managed to do, which is enormously important but attitudinal, is they have got every Danish citizen believing that if he loses his job, it's his duty to get another one. That's what you do if you're Danish. That's an important attitude, and we don't all have that here. And I don't know how, I'm not sure that it's government's duty to do that, but either you begin with this philosophy in Denmark that is widely shared. Interestingly, it's not widely shared amongst their immigrant population. The program hasn't been very successful with their immigrants, and they would be the first one to tell you that there's been a division between the way it's helped Danes relocate and retrain and the way it's helped immigrants retrain and relocate. They have a whole different history of immigration than we do too, which you well know, and is, it's a European history, not the kind of history that we have here. Fundamentally, what happens briefly is you lose your job, you get a benefit package that's about a little more than 90% of what you were getting before. So it's a very significant benefit. The government then activates you, tries to, that's the word, the term they use, try to activate you, which is to put you into a program of sort of job training and retraining and trying to work with you as an individual to figure out what the best path is for you to find another job. The most interesting thing that they do in that regard that I thought was ingenious, and it never occurred to me in all the years I spent working on this, is that the government, the private parties provide the retraining. The government pays for it. It's part of the government program. But the government only pays 25% up front. The training company doesn't get the other 75% until the individual's found a job. That forces then the company to look at this problem differently. It's not simply providing a set of skills and moving people on an assembly line out into the world. It's working with them, first of all, to provide training and skills that actually are needed in the economy. So they have to pay a lot more attention to demand. Mm-hmm. And then second, it's working on interview skills, resume building skills, job search skills, a whole panoply of things that are designed not only to make you able to do the job, but to enable you to get one, because they don't get paid until you get one. It never occurred to me, and I think it's brilliant.
Excellent. That's one solution. Jeff mentioned wage insurance. Only time it's been mentioned in this discussion, and I'm wondering if there's a there, and whether you think there is.
Yes, you want my opinion. It's a good thing to look at.
There is. It's just, it's a question of cost and how broad a participation, how long a commitment, and whether you apply it to a narrow segment of impacted workers or the broader displacement problem, which could be, a significant revenue cost. Given the fact that the Congress twisted itself in knots to appropriate $475 million a year for TAA, down more than 50% from its peak expenditures just a few years before, I think, and wage insurance costs will be significantly higher than peak TAA costs. You'd have to find some additional revenue sources, but there's been a lot written about this over the past decade or more, and by people in both parties. But the attraction of it is you're providing incentives for the worker to go and get look for a new position rather than wait for his old position to come back, which was the problem back in the 20th century, and I think is increasingly not a possibility in the 21st century.
The interesting thing is that I've seen one paper by Laurie Kletzer, several years old, commissioned maybe by Peterson, I'm not sure, which really, for the first time, for me anyway, explained what it is and how it might work. And I've seen very little serious examination of the idea, but Jamie, you have some ideas, I think.
I was going to suggest one, too.
Okay.
Let me put a number on what Jeff just said. The Financial Services Forum produced a paper in '08 that addressed this, and what they did was they proposed to combine unemployment insurance and TAA into a single program, and expanded program, which would include wage insurance, health insurance portability, reemployment services, assistance with relocation, retraining, so on and so forth. The wage insurance program would be for older workers, age 45 and up, and it would replace 50% of their lost wages for up to 2 years or for up to $10,000 per year. And then there's some details. I think the salient point is that the estimated annual cost of that program is $22 billion. Now, that replaces existing programs, so that's not a net increase in spending of $22 billion, but it's a big program. And as Jeff said, we would have to come up with the money somewhere. That's the Finance Committee's problem.
So wage insurance, for those of you that don't really know what wage insurance is, the concept is that you would have insurance on your wages. So if you lost your job due to no fault of your own, and you took a job that paid significantly less, maybe because your old job doesn't exist anymore, for some period of time, that insurance would help augment your wages. I will flag for you that several years ago, the Ways and Means Committee held some hearings on wage insurance. The Joint Economic Committee held a hearing on wage insurance. It was then chaired by Senator Schumer. Representative McDermott and Schumer put forward a proposal on wage insurance. And if I recall correctly, I may have this wrong, but if I recall correctly, one of the options was to finance it by indexing the wage base of the federal unemployment tax. The base right now is $7,000 as a tax on the first $7,000 of income that an employer pays an employee. That number hasn't changed in decades, so you could index that to inflation. There's lots of ways you can pay for it. I will say that wage insurance is it was actually President Obama mentioned it in the State of the Union, so I think it's in his budget.
Give me.
Organized labor is very much opposed to wage insurance. They fear that wage insurance will be used as a way to replace unemployment insurance. So there is a political problem with wage insurance, but I think we're right to talk about ways to improve the unemployment insurance system, to talk about wage insurance, to talk about subsidized employment, and to also talk about ways in which labor exchange, so matching workers with employers, can be improved. We're pretty good at inventing apps for single people to find other single people to date, but I think we could do a much better job of matching workers with employers.
Dan.
Before we focus so much on these new ideas, what about existing problems that create frictions in the labor market? Things like occupational licensing, minimum wage laws, private incentives to grant retraining to workers, provided that retraining is within the current job that they have and the current industry that they have. It seems that there are incentives in place that dissuade the flow of labor. So why do we add new layers of programs?
We may need to add new layers, but at the same time correct the old ones.
Yeah, without addressing the old ones first. And one of the, just to get back to something Jeff said about infrastructure and infrastructure spending and how foreign trade negotiators are, it's imperative that they push the U.S. to open up and to make concessions so that we have to change our laws, because that's dynamic. Things like the Jones Act, which you're not even allowed to talk about up here. But you know, the Panama Canal was just widened, and there are only 2 or 3 ports east of the Panama Canal that can accommodate these large post-Panamax ships. Seems to me there's a lot of work that can be done there if we were to, address the Dredge Act, the Jones Act, things like that. So in other words, there are things to affect the demand side for labor,
that's a good
rather
point.
than the supply.
And Jamie mentioned it earlier. Well, I think this is very helpful. We've come to the point of talking about solutions. Anybody have any other ideas? And is there another question? Let's see. I'll go right here.
Hi, Jack Caprell with Inside U.S. Trade. My question regardless of policy, there is a framing issue in terms of the advantages and disadvantages of trade and employment, and it seems as though the pro-trade business community is having a tough time responding to some of those arguments, despite the fact that the response here has been very thorough. And so my question is, and I think it's also worth mentioning that, you know, the idea that they're kind of losing that battle of ideas has implications for trade votes and the trade agenda in the future.
Who's losing which battle of ideas?
The pro-trade community. It seems as though they're losing the battle of ideas that trade is net positive for employment. Right. Well, that's it. It's the general sentiment. Maybe you can disagree. Right.
This panel is pretty pro-trade. I don't know. Be careful.
Regardless, I'm just wondering where you think the messaging went a little bit wrong, and whether or not that's fixable in the short term.
Which messaging?
Thank you. I mean, I don't know if you disagree with the premise of the question.
To be asked questions.
I don't know if you disagree with the premise of the question that just as the pro-trade, traditionally pro-trade folks, especially some here on the Hill, are having a tough time defending the merits of free trade because of, you know, arguments that trade causes offshoring, et cetera. And I'm wondering, you know, how do you correct that in the short term?
Good.
I can
Good question.
deal with that
Thank
in
you.
part. You know, you're sort of asking for a why did you lose analysis at halftime, and it's premature to do that. The particular game isn't over yet. It won't be over at best until sometime after the election. And I think that I mean, my own view is that this, from our point of view, well, I shouldn't speak for everybody, but from a pro-TPP point of view, that particular debate might very well have a happy ending, in which case you'll be asking different questions, which is, why did we win? Not, or, you know, what was the brilliant strategy we pursued that was successful? If you ask me, having looked at a number of these things over the years, the debate's following the normal trajectory, which is this wave of opposition that is loud and well-organized, and I think louder and better organized this time than past times. But it's always out in front, and it always appears to be doing very well until the end game. And the end game comes when the people that vote actually begin to focus on this. Some have, of course, the relevant committees have been thinking about this for a long time. But you know, the members that are not on the relevant committees, they're going to focus on this, you know, in the couple of weeks before they have to vote on it, and they're only going to do that if they know they have to vote on it, which they don't know right now. At that point, I think you'll see the same arc that you've seen before, which is that the arguments, really, that the president has been making, which are, I think, the winning arguments, which are more, in fairness, more national security arguments and geopolitical arguments, the trade arguments. I think in the end they'll prevail. But I would argue this is really no different than the TPA debate. It was no different than the China PNTR debate. It wasn't really that much different than the Uruguay round debate or even the Tokyo round debate. These things have a way of you know, they just follow this path. The business community is well known for, you know, coming late to the party, but when it arrives in full force and with a lot of logic behind it. And I mean, the optimist in me thinks that's going on right now. But even if I'm wrong, I think your question is better asked at the end of the game and not in the middle of it.
Well, I think the questioner has a good point. You know, having observed, okay, I started in this business in 1965 when I went to work for a Ways and Means Committee member. So I've seen a lot of these debates. This one seems to be much more. The weight of argument seems to be much more on the side of the opponents, especially given the positions of both candidates. And I think the pro arguments, which are right, we have the arguments. I don't think there's any question about the fact that the pro position has the best arguments. They just haven't made it. They haven't been put forward, and the people don't understand them. And it is really late in the game. Really, really late. And we've allowed, partly because of, okay, I'll say it, the flaccidity of this administration in its first 4 years on trade, issues, partly letting the naysayers have their head and not innovating, not moving the agenda. It's been, I think, this particular group of opponents has really got ahead of steam.
Bob, may I just add to that? I mean, I grant your question. I mean, I think there is something to that. And there's a distinction between the discussion on Capitol Hill and the discussion in the broader media and the polled public. People have different perspectives on trade. I share Bill's outlook that I could see Hillary Clinton very easily making the case that it's in our geostrategic interest to ratify the TPP, and I suspect that is what's going to be the winning argument next year. But I didn't. But
I want to take bets on that. Let's have a poll.
But look, I've been saying this for the past few years. We have a president who's a lukewarm advocate of trade. He has not been a particularly good spokesman. He was involved in the launch of the TPP, but in the 2012 election, he wasn't embracing trade. He speaks very defensively about it. We need to keep up with globalization, or else we're going to be run over by China. We still hear that same sort of rhetoric, and there was a failure to address his caucus and to push back and make positive cases for trade, to back up to Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid to answer those questions. And I think that the opposition has gone unrebutted for the most part. And I think if we had a different outlook from a different type of president, we may have had more pushback. But so I think you're right. I think the climate has been somewhat poisoned, and you guys are still holding out hope. And I think obviously,
well, we all hold out hope. We have to be hopeful.
Bob, just a point.
Please.
I think it is grossly unfair and intellectually incorrect to say that the trade utterances of the president at a time when he saved tens of millions of jobs in this country by getting us out of the deepest recession that we've had since the 30s.
what does that have to do with trade?
It has a lot to do because if you were inside listening to the arguments, the protectionist constituencies in the Democratic Party were told that they had gotten a payoff from the huge domestic reforms and programs that were instituted to basically address the recession, and that they would have to accede to the trade reform agenda that was proceeding in the first term of the administration. And the second term of the administration produced the best trade agreement that's been achieved in the last 20 years.
We're talking about salesmanship of this. This appeals to wonks, not to the broader public. So, the president was absent and was engaging in protectionist rhetoric.
Microphone, please.
So, anyway, I don't think it's intellectually challenged to make that point.
But
I don't think he's been a very good.
Okay, you're criticizing the president,
We'll discuss this after.
but how do you compare the president's rhetoric with Donald Trump's?
His rhetoric it's good now. Look, he made all these concessions and said, "Hey, unions, follow me. I bailed out the auto industry." Did they follow him? Is 28 Democrats voting for TPA a success? I mean, that's pretty paltry. In my opinion.
Colombia,
question again.
Panama.
Yeah, he got
Does
those
anybody want to
done.
answer Jamie's question?
The rhetoric is very different, totally different.
Okay.
Between Trump and Obama? No, they're not comparable. They're not
have
comparable.
another
I'm not
question.
making that comparison.
Okay, back there. Kim.
Here. Hi. I wanted to ask a non-political question, which it has to do with incumbent workers or workers who are still employed, and whether there are any programs that are available to help them or help companies that do employ them to retrain them and kind of reorient them in a changing economy. Because in my work at GAO, at least, we've talked to, it seems like there's some not very much available in that department.
Julie, you want to stand up? Sure. That microphone works? Punch it. Punch it.
Sure, I'm Julie Baker, filling in for Jerry Fiala from the U.S. Department of Labor. I guess what I would say about incumbent worker, there is training under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA, as Jerry had mentioned. I have heard that is fairly consistent. Is there enough? There's not enough training in this area. I agree that certainly more could be done, but I believe that under the WIOA Act, there's a lot of sort of discretion that each state can apply some of their own reserve funds towards their needs in each state. Under the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, we do have adversely affected incumbent worker training. It is not geared towards keeping people in the same position, clearly, because their jobs are threatened or they are approaching a layoff. But while they are working and threatened, they can go ahead and enter the training programs to cut down and have, as we were talking about a little bit earlier, layoff aversion, so that their time in unemployment can hopefully be lessened so that they can enter a job right away.
Thank you. Listen, I think the witching hour has come. I must say this has been an extremely rich conversation, not surprisingly because of the quality and experience of the panelists. I'm really glad this has been recorded. It will be available soon and on the center's website. And I just want to ask you to join me in thanking this really excellent group of presenters.